Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. Today we have with us Danielle Fisher. Danielle is about to complete his PhD at the University of California, Irvine in the Department of Informatics, the School of Computer and Information Science, studying with Paul Derisch. For many years I've been following Danielle's work. It has been an interesting journey. He has planted himself, I would say, at the crossroads of the social and the information sciences. Probably firmly planted in the information sciences, but certainly a welcome interloper into the realms of the social sciences. Today, I believe his presentation will be exploring ways of data mining email and visualizing the results, which I think is very timely for many projects ongoing at Microsoft and MSR. So I hope you will all welcome Danielle Fisher and thank him for coming. Thank you.
Great, thanks for having me here today. As Mark said, my name is Danielle Fisher. My topic today is talking about social and temporal patterns in everyday collaboration. And I'd like to get started first by walking through one of the more basic and common social and temporal pattern in everyday collaboration by walking through an example that many of us at least are familiar with. Let's say this red dot in the center represents me. In that case, I've been working for a while on a series of computer programs represented by the little document icons there. And as I work on these programs, I've sent 1.5 tons of email to my advisor about it. And sooner or later, we got it pretty well working. We brought in other people who helped us develop and extend the code, and then put it out in front of users. Of course, all of this required lots of communication, lots of coordination work. We wrote up a document explaining what we'd done, which we presented in a couple of different contexts, and eventually sent off to anonymous reviewers for a conference, who sent back comments on it, and eventually got it in, which is why I've been off doing the Danielle Fisher Roadshow ever since. Unfortunately, my computer doesn't show me anything like that organization of documents. In fact, it shows me something much more like this, a rather impoverished list of information. I would presumably prefer to organize my information to know something about how these different contexts fit together, like that last view that I was showing, or back here. What I'd like to suggest then is that we interact with each other in a variety of ways, and that these ways are actually structured with each other. Our contacts are not just an undifferentiated list of names, and our documents are not really fundamentally separate from the interactions that we create with them and the sets of people who we interact with over those documents. So what I'd like to do is talk for a little bit about the importance of relationships. I'm going to talk in particular about social networks, and think in particular of those about social networks and the ways that they can be used as a tool for end users. I'm going to talk a little bit about temporal structures. Then I'm going to talk about ways that we can reveal some of the structure of the interactions between us. I'm going to talk about a field study that I've done that helps to bring out some of those interactions and to show you some of the results that we found from that study. And last, I'll connect this to some design aspects to suggest ways that we might bring our interactive tools for the future so that they bring out some of these aspects. First, I'd like to start off by talking about what I mean by designing for everyday collaboration. I'd like to see relationships between people as first-class manipulable entities. That's a computer science term meaning that you can grab them, find them, locate them, and use them as indexes into information. In particular, I'd like to look at the relationships between people, artifacts, and times are the three things that I'm going to be connecting. So we do these sorts of connections, of course, all the time. We ask things like, where is that file from John, which is connecting a document to a person? We say, someone in this group in the last week sent that paper that I wanted to look up. That's a time limit on a set of people and a document. Where do I know this person from is a fairly common question. That's often a person-to-person connection, because the answer is, oh yeah, Mark told me about him. And who do I talk to if not X is often a question that at least comes up in my life. The person who I wanted to speak to isn't available. What other people are in a similar relationship to me besides that person who might be able to fulfill that particular need of mine? So the tools that I've built are trying to explore some of the ways that we can understand those interactions and think about those questions. Now, people have been working on this sort of question for quite a while. The first implementation I'd like to at least mention is that Apple Mail and iChat and also Outlook have begun to move towards this notion of a unified person through the operating system, so that wherever you look, this person recurs. Both the Outlook and the Mail version have begun to connect, for example, the person sitting in your buddy list to the person sitting in your mail, so that you can begin so that they're not actually a different person, a different identity between these different applications, and so that you can jump back and forth between them. What I'm going to do for a little bit is talk about the framework that I've built to make relationships between people visible. And what I'm thinking about is, again, this ultimate big system vision of making relationships visible and adding people to applications through a series of awareness tools, things that, again, bring out the connections between people in different contexts, different settings, and between each other. In this particular work, in my dissertation work, what I've done is I've tried to work on ways of seeing and bringing out those particular relationships. I haven't done as much of the application integration side, but I will show you some of the design movements. So I want to talk about, as I said before, both social structure and temporal structure. The form of social structure that I'm going to be talking about today is social networks, these connections between people. Social networks are commonly used for looking at groups from the outside. Social network analysts, for example, will collect information from a large number of people and then talk about their interconnections. They might use that as a way of diagnosing the functions of an organization, understanding the information flow within a group, or looking at the transmission of diseases are very common examples of social network studies. I'd like to look at a somewhat different study and look at using social networks as a way of benefiting end users from the end user's perspective. And this is not necessarily an external view, and in fact the way that I'm going to be looking at it is looking at the slice of the social network that the end user sees from their perspective. I'm going to be talking in particular about ways that we can use social networks for design, because I come from a computer-supported collaborative work background. I'm also going to be talking briefly about temporal rhythms. We're all familiar with the idea of chronological time, the way that days pass, weeks, months, and years. Those are all well marked on our schedules. Several sociologists, most notably Sorokin, pointed out that time also comes socially, that we break things up in ways that are socially defined rather than defined by calendars. So, for example, we might talk about the duration of an assignment or a project as a period of time that's important to us. We also mark time socially. For example, summer quarter doesn't really correspond to anything of the seasons, but students certainly know how long it lasts. As well as lunchtime, similarly, may not be exactly the same set of hours, but is socially defined for a given group or a given context. Last, there's things like life cycle sorts of time, like adolescence. So I'm going to be looking at time periods, not specifically as defined by calendars, but more as defined by the way that we interact with the time. Which leads us with this sort of problem. I've talked about a lot of different levels of detail, both of time and a lot of different scopes of networks, both from group networks all the way out to much larger organizational ones. What level of detail do we use to break this down? I'd like to talk then about how there are many possible levels. There's individual levels all the way up through large groups. There's these fine-grained events all the way up through long durations. And so there's actually a challenge of finding a meaningful level of description. The level that I'm working on is to talk about patterns. This is a level where users communicate with each other and communicate with us. So patterns I'm using as a shorthand for recurrent features, things that show up over and over again, ways of talking about stuff that people repeatedly use. And so I oriented my data collection, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, about the stories that users tell me and about the things that I observe, rather than trying to pull out specific things and see whether the users see it. So I'm using patterns as a way to understand relationships between people. I organized then my work around these two questions. One, are there in fact recognizable recurrent interaction patterns in our electronic communication activities? And second, if there are, can these patterns be used to design software systems that are in fact attentive to social roles? I would suggest that the answer to the first of those questions, is this data there, is it meaningful, can be answered by remembering back to that first diagram that I brought up. Here's sort of an outline of it. And there's some people who I know definitely through my email connections. I know who my advisor is. I've got an email to him explicitly. There's also a series of groups that may or may not be particularly well defined. The set of people to whom I presented this talk. The set of people to whom I sent this paper to be evaluated. The person from whom I got a response. The set of users to whom I sent this connection. So those traces are there and available in my computer system, even though we don't yet know how to pull them out. So I'd like to work on ways that we can look at, examine, and understand these traces. What I've done then is I've built an experimental apparatus. This is going to be a tool that helps us work with end users to find these patterns in the structures of communication. The sort of communication I've chosen for this project is specifically looking at outgoing email. Email is nice because it provides a lot of the structural information with it. Certainly there are lots of other ways that I could have looked at other sorts of information sources too. So what I'm going to do is a several-step process. I call this project Soylent because it's made out of people. We start with outgoing emails and read them down into a database. We then are going to visualize this database both over here in the social network view and down here in a temporal view. So I'll show you a series of social network and temporal visualizations coming out of this processed database. I'd like to walk you briefly through the form of social network analysis that I'm doing. Again, it's somewhat different from the traditional external social network view. In a traditional social network view, we would read a message from A to X and Y in this way. We'd say, this is evidence that A knows X and that A knows Y. In the view that we're using here, we say that from A's perspective, this is evidence that X and Y know each other, that they have something in common. Not that they know each other, but they have something in common, that they have some shared context. A had some reason to link X and Y. They are interested in the same topic of this message. So with a second message to Y and Z, this tells us that from A's perspective, Y and Z are somehow connected. In a traditional social network view, we would have lost some of this information about the connection between Y and Z. Over here, we've got that. When I bring in a third message, we begin to see that even more structure and data comes out. What this ultimately looks like is something like this. And indeed, this is the visualization for the interface for my system. This is, ordinarily there would be names here. I've anonymized it for the purposes of being able to transmit this over the web. But what you're seeing here is a series of different clusters. Here, for example, is a cluster of 3 friends of mine. This is my own outgoing mail in this picture, who I have co-sent email to in various pairs of them, and sometimes all 3. So this cluster appears tied together. This is a workshop that I was involved in a couple years ago, and so that whole cluster together are all interconnected between each other. There's also things like here where a central person up top coordinated a series of projects with various other people around them. And last, there's this large morass up here, which is a combination of both personal life and work life. I'll talk a little bit about how we can disconnect those and pull out the different contexts within that larger mass. I'd also like to point out that there's a notion of tie strength exhibited on the left there. That's the number of messages that had to connect a pair of people in order to be displayed on this visualization. Sometimes there's people who get connected into connections very loosely. You once thought that these 2 people might have something in common. You sent them both a message. That connection hasn't recurred. On the other hand, there's often connections that happen repeatedly, so this is a way of modulating how many of those connections you want to be visible. There's also hidden down at the bottom a notion of time so that you can actually look at the start and end time of different connections and can try and get the social network view at different periods. What I did then was I brought a variant of this tool to a field site, a large research organization and development group on the East Coast, and I ran a series of extended interviews. I did this with researchers, with developers, with managers, and with secretaries. I had at least 2 of each of those. So for each of these groups, I ran the program on their email, and I looked over their shoulders, trying to understand what they were seeing and asked them questions. So we talked for a little while about what the clusters they saw were, and how these interactions happened. What we found, in fact, was that there were things and stories that I heard over and over again. They were recurrent patterns that happened at different times, in different places, with different people. They seemed to be meaningful. They would be attached to stories. They would interconnect. And so what I'd like to do is walk you through a couple of the different patterns that we've seen by showing you different screenshots of the Soylent application, run on different users and different people, and show you some of the things that came up in common between these different groups. I'd like to emphasize that the displays I'm showing you are not necessarily end-user displays. These are visualizations that I used as an analyst, that I show to other analysts to understand the nature of this data. It's not completely clear to me that end users necessarily want to be able to see this sort of social network view, although that's certainly a possibility. I'd also like to emphasize again that you're seeing these egocentric displays. These are somewhat different than social network displays, and to people who have done social network analysis, there's almost a change in perspective that you have to think through. And last, I'd like to point out that the images that I'm going to show you are not only from this field site. I got some of them later at my university, at a second field site, and some of them come from my own archives. That's mostly in order to anonymize them and to clean up the data so that they are, again, showable in public. I'd like to start off with a couple of different social structures that we saw. First off is this onion view. The onion is a core and periphery model. There's a tight center and a loose outside. So, for example, when you have a perhaps central research team with a series of consultants or developers around them, that would often look like an onion. The researchers would more often email each other, but the developers would sit on the outside and the consultants might sit even further out from that, being more loosely tied to the center. And simply by tightening that minimum connection field that I showed you, the developers would begin to fall off. I saw this in other contexts too. For example, this is a view of a workshop within a conference. The person whose mail this is had sent out a bunch of email both to this central workshop and out to the conference as a whole. So you see this tighter core and this outer periphery around it. When you begin to knock up the minimum strength so that you can extract where the core is, in this case, you find that the core is a central clique. Every person in here is connected to every other person. This is the standard view of a mailing list, but it's also the view of any tightly connected group where the different people are well connected with each other, do have a lot of things to say to each other. A second, somewhat different view that we often saw was the butterfly. In the butterfly, one person sits at the center of 2 different sets of connections. Bob is involved in both my carpool and in my research group. This person was involved in both this one project that had a group of people associated with it and some other project that had a very different group of people associated with it. In this particular view, you're seeing this one person who was involved both in a research group over here and was involved in a research group on the right and a conference workshop on the left. From the person whose mail this is, from their perspective, that one person coexisted in both groups. Now, a traditional social network view would see this as a bridge and might want to talk about how that person is a way of connecting information between the 2 groups. I'd like to suggest that it's somewhat different in this case. After all, if I really want to get from my carpool to my work group, the best connection isn't through someone else, it's very probably through me. However, there's other things that I can do with this information. For one thing, when we're talking about the design implications, we probably don't want this one person, we don't want to automatically assume that they're associated with either group. They really do live in 2 different of my worlds. They do have 2 different sets of functions. To give a different example of this multiple different contexts, here's what we call the nexus view. This is when one person sits at the center of a number of different contexts and a number of different interconnections. This was very common with managers, for example. I would carbon copy my manager that I had finished a project, as well as someone else who was involved in that project. I would later carbon copy the manager and a different person, a manager and yet a third person. As each different project occurred, different people would be involved. The manager was the common denominator, so it was always at the center. So this is our example of the nexus pattern. Secretaries were very similar for slightly different reasons. You often saw a secretary sitting at the center when you had a cluster of, for example, arranging travel, arranging for supplies that you needed, arranging for recruitment. The secretary would always be at the center, was in common between these many different activities. In this particular case, this is actually an example of a collaborator. This person collaborated on one project that involved this cluster of people over here, and was also involved in a number of different projects at different times. And each of these different activities and each of these different groups, again, had this carbon copy link. So the person sits at the center of these different contexts. I'd like to spend a few minutes also talking about the different temporal structures that we saw. Then I'll go back and bring these together. I'd like to start off by talking about the Actogram, which was popularized in CSCW by Beau Bigol. In the Actogram view, you have days of the week across and time of day down. What I've done is I've actually put in a little gray bar at each point where an outgoing email message was sent from this outgoing mailbox. And what you start seeing is some things about the user whose mail this is. This is actually my own mail. And this is nighttime. I don't send a great deal of mail at night, although there's clearly times when I am, in fact, up at 3 or 4 in the morning sending out email. There's a couple other things you see. I tend to be asleep by 1 or 2 in the morning. I tend to wake up by around 9-ish. And I've then gone ahead and done the next step and highlighted one particular user in red. That correspondent is my advisor. So red bars indicate email that I have sent to my advisor. My advisor and I have meetings on Thursday afternoons, and so we tend to have a lot of email right before and right after those meetings. In fact, there's a build-up over the week as that meeting comes closer and as we have more to say to each other about the sort of things that are happening. There's one other time that I seem to send a surprising amount of email to my advisor compared to other times. That's Saturday mornings at 1:30 a.m. If I am up at 1:30 a.m. sending email to anyone, it's my advisor. This is a sure sign of a PhD student. You can contrast this with a different organizational view. This was one of the administrative assistants at the other organization that I was at my field site. This is a person who lived a very structured schedule. She was in the office sending email by, 8:30 in the morning, and was out by 6 p.m. every day. She came in slightly later midweek, slightly earlier on the weekend, or on the Monday and Friday. The other thing I'd like to bring out with this particular view is a lesson I learned from this person, that not only are the regularities important, but so are the exceptions. Exceptions to behavior are worth noting. In this case, she couldn't particularly tell me what any of these lumps or bumps in the middle meant, but she certainly could tell me what each and every time that she had been in the office outside of her regular schedule was. Each of these represented a story. The time that her manager needed emergency plane tickets, the time that her manager needed a presentation to be together suddenly. So those exceptions were of significance. You'll also note that the vast majority of her messages are in fact painted red. She was closely connected with her manager, who is highlighted here in red, and so virtually every message that she sent was either carbon copied with this half-size bar, or was sent entirely to with the full-size bar, her manager. The last view that I'd like to bring out is a longer-term one, not accumulating information this time and giving you temporal aggregates, but rather trying to look at long-range trends. This is a view of a single person within a top 10 list. So what I've done is, for each month, say February here, I've listed the top 10 people in someone's outgoing mailbox. I did this view with the users too, trying to get some sense for how people's interactions changed. So, for example, interns come in for 3 months during the summer. So the person who is coordinating an intern would suddenly see for 3 months during the summer the names of the interns pop up to the top of the list. They were consuming most of their outgoing email for those 3 months, and then would suddenly disappear again when the interns left. Conversely, this is sort of the opposite of that. This is a person who went on leave for a while and left town. They were right up there, top 2, top 3 messages for a while till about September. They dropped down in October. That was the month of departure. And all of a sudden are down there in 7, 8 land. They are that's when they were communicating less often with this person, and so became less involved in the project flow, had fewer connections, had fewer things to say. Around January, they started coming back in. The number of messages that they were sending began to grow. They became back involved in the project, and by March and April, we're back up to their former status in the top 2 or 3 recipients again. What are the outlines of? I've highlighted. In green is what the...
But then there's some that don't have the black.
Right. That's actually the raw quantity of messages. So that people who got fewer than 10 messages that month are not highlighted or are not outlined. So that tells you that April had kind of incomplete data, actually, and December had a lot fewer messages in general. So the bottom people in the top 10 list weren't boxed at all. 10 was the constraint, yeah. Again, most months far more than cleared that for each of the top 10 people. I'd like to go back to the social network views for a moment to talk about how we connect networks with time and with changes over time. So this is a fairly complex looking network. What I've done here is I've taken one particular correspondent in outgoing mail, and I've looked at all the people who connect to them, and then all the interconnections between those people. So this is someone and the people who are connected to them. Because, as I suggested earlier, the distance 3 and distance 4 really isn't as important in this context, this is sort of trying to get a picture of who this person is. Unfortunately, it's a pretty crowded bunch until I code it by time. Now what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've marked each edge and each box by what the most recent connection with this person was. So, white boxes I haven't seen for a while, since October of 2001. Darker gray I haven't seen since May of 02, October of 02, and there's actually very few boxes of the more recent types. Here's some, or even darker up there. And I've marked that both for the edges between people and for the boxes at the ends of the edges. What these different edges say to me is that this person's this person's role actually changed over time, or the people around them changed. When I spoke with my interviewee trying to understand what we were seeing here, he told me that that person was a social coordinator. She had run a regular group of graduate students who gathered routinely and hung out and talked. Graduate students, however, are in the bad habit of graduating, and so don't hang out with this group anymore. So this was the cluster who graduated in 2001. This was the graduating cluster in 2002. This was the graduating cluster in 2003. Individual boxes are then labeled by what the most recent that the person who I was interviewing, not the social coordinator, but my interviewee, what the most recent time that they had been in touch with what each individual person was. And so you can see that this guy stayed in touch with with some people even after they dropped out of this social coordination group. So right here, for example, is a friend of his. She graduated, she moved out of town, she dropped out of the social group, and so dropped off of the email list, but still stayed in touch, and so her box is a little bit darker. Some of the other people who have graduated more recently are even more in touch. Some of the other views that I showed you also have temporal extents. So I talked to you about the butterfly view before. Here, in fact, is a cluster that can be very well separated by the two different times of the two different events that brought together these two groups. What I've done now is I've showed you a series of different patterns I showed you this way back, the onion with the clique, and I showed you this nexus pattern in which one person was connected in a number of different contexts. I showed you a butterfly and talked about how sometimes that can be broken out over time. And I showed you some both schedule regularities and changes over time. I've made up this terminology. Again, the social network people might be a little bit itchy because some of these do closely resemble social network patterns that have well-known names. I've brought in different names and different terminology because I'm trying to force you to look at it from this strange egocentric perspective, from the view of the person who is sending the mail and doing the communication. I'd like now to talk a little bit about the design implications of these patterns, to talk a little bit about what these mean to users and what we can do with them. So what I'd like to point out is that these patterns help us understand something about the shape of the interaction, so we can base some designs around the insights that we gain from these patterns. I'm going to be talking in particular about two different types of designs. One of them is a set of different awareness tools where we can start thinking about how this pattern gives us information about what our users, about how different people are interacting with us over time. And the other, I'd like to talk a little bit about application integration and build in tools, and build these information into tools. So my first attempt was to just directly apply social network analysis tools to drop in things like finding automatic groups. Unfortunately, social network analysis isn't really designed for this sort of thing. It wants to find a specific group for each person to give them a single identity within a clique or a plex or a clan. Unfortunately, many of these patterns suggest, in fact, that people have multiple identities, that they're connected to many different contexts, that what we have to find is the variety of different things. So even though social network analysis gives us reasonable answers, it tells me successfully that this person is in my carpool. It fails to mention that they're also in my work group. So the social network tools are somewhat hard to apply and may not even connect to some of the things that we're really looking for. So my next take was to put on more of a heuristic approach. And so what I'm going to be talking about is ways that we've looked for activity peaks, places where the most dominant interactions have happened with the person, and how we've looked for network clusters. And so I have a number of different heuristics that look for connections both in original emails and also in things that have become dense cliques over time. So groups that have gathered up and have many recurrent messages between them. So I'd like to talk about some of the very basic design insights that come out of these. The Nexus and Butterfly, for example, both tell us that people have multiple different contexts, that they have different interactions, and that we can understand something about the contexts by understanding who is involved in them. The Onion tells us that relationships happen across multiple levels, that there can be both inner members and outer members. Now, these are well known to CSCW. I think my contribution for this part, at least, is showing that these are actually observable phenomena in the traces between people. So I'd like to give you sort of an example of where we see this research going. We're imagining something like a social proxy here that kind of gives you an overview of your day or of your recent time span. So working off of ideas explored by, for example, Tom Erickson's work with Babel, you have sort of a outwards is time from most recent to a while ago, from most active to not so active. At the center you have a couple of people working on a document. This is presumably the thing that you're working on right now. It's supported by an archive and maybe some previous messages. Off to the side you see some other things, some other people collaborating over some other documents, maybe some email lists and clusters over there, some other past connections. And here's a project that used to be very active but really isn't so active anymore, but you should be aware that it's out there because it used to be a big deal in your life. This is sort of a hypothetical example of where we'd like to see this going. The first stage approximation to that was a tool called Tell Me About, which gives you a quick view of a person. So this is asking to tell me about this given person, B. Markham here. Tells you some very basic statistics. I've exchanged 79 messages with them. Our first was on March 23rd, 2001. It gives the most recent message. It gives some of the activity peaks, when we were most connecting. And it gives some of the closest connections, other people who are connected with these. Turns out that this is actually not too bad a first summary. These really do correspond to 2 times that were particularly important in my connections with this person. This was a professor who I both co-published with and TA'd for. This was the grading period, this was the publication deadline. This was the other TA, and this was the other person who this was the co-author for the paper. So these names and connections really do begin to mean a little bit. But this is still somewhat impoverished information, so the next view actually was trying to bring back some of that social network information. So here's a variant of this tool called Tell Me About Visual. In the visual version of Tell Me About, we still have that text information up top of when the closest connections were, of who the closest connections were and when the dominant period was. I've also begun to bring in file attachments, so I know something about what we were saying to each other. Then what I also have here is 4 rows of information: outgoing and incoming email messages, and outgoing and incoming number of message attachments. So the top row is outgoing email, then incoming email messages across this timeline to give some activity, to give some notion of activity over time. This person, Sheila, is connected to a number of different connections. And over here, we see that Sheila has been connected to each of these at different times. One of these connections, I connected Sheila to Ron a very long time ago, but have been in touch with Ron much more recently. So Ron has this darker square. So this begins to give an idea of how you can connect some of these pieces of information together. So this is a first overview of a possible awareness tool, a first view of what it might be to pop up a little bit of information about a person and give a little bit of their history and your perspective on them. The next step was to integrate this into an application where people are already present. Following the trends of this work, which was thinking about using it on email, we built it into this. This is the system that we ended up calling Enhanced Email for People. A team of undergraduates implemented it for me based on a data set that I had built for them. This is based off of the Java Icemail client, which is an open source email client. It's got a lot of limitations, but what it did allow them to do was fairly easily extend it. So what they did was they attached to every message panel this list of names on the side. This is not only the people who are directly involved in the message, but also people who seem to be connected to that set of people. So if it was a clique -1 or a clique -2 to whom that message went out, it adds those last few names onto the end of the list. It also allows some group connections. For each of these names, then, you can pull up both the ordinary address book mention, you can pull up a history of messages that you have sent to that person or that you have received from that person, and you can also pull up the social network visualization around that person, so that you can, in fact, see over here that Jen is connected to this large cluster over here and to some stuff over on the edge. And there's ways of pulling in those other messages. The other thing that this tool allowed them to do is on outgoing email, as you begin to type in the message, when you press comma and add another name, the system goes through your mail history, figures out what set of people are most associated with that person, and then begins to show them over here. So this outgoing message to Roger Jones, well, I've seen Roger Jones before. I've seen Roger Jones associated with John MacArthur. I've seen him associated with Moody and with Wellington. I've seen him associated with Ken. So it builds out this list of other people who you might also mean when you mean Roger, and allows you to pick from that. This is the same as the sort of type ahead that we're all very familiar with things like Outlook, except going ahead to type ahead for the whole group as opposed to just one name at a time. I'd like to take a moment to talk about some of the visualization tools that I've used. I frequently get asked how I generate the visualizations. The system that you're seeing is actually a large mass of pieces put together from various sources. In particular, Java programmers tend to want to know where I got the line charts from. That's from this project called JFreeChart. I'd also like to take a moment to talk about the Jung project, the Java Unified Network Graph Toolkit that I use to draw all the network visualizations that you've seen today. I actually brewed that with a couple of artificial intelligence students over at UCI. We got frustrated that there were no open source toolkits for easily building social network visualizations. And so we were finding that people had to rebuild the same thing over and over. So we built a Java framework for graph modeling, analysis, and visualization. It's object-oriented. It allows for very easy visualization. You drop in a graph and tell it to visualize it, and it does. It allows for a rich attribute structure, and it allows for very complex filtering, so you can pull out structural, social, and personal information from this graph and get limited subgraphs. It's also highly programmable, so it's easy to do the same thing over and over again, and it lives as a library. So we've used it before as clients, as servers, and as a small part of a much larger application. It's extensible, so that if you need a new routine, you can put it in yourself, and it's open source, so that if you don't like the way that we've implemented a routine, and many people haven't, you can rewrite it yourself. This has led us to a number of different applications, ranging from the Tell Me About that I showed you earlier, to this system, which is a visualization of collaboration over a CVS code base. Connections has both touched the same file. As I said, that gets used in this larger system where it can be connected to other sorts of information. So over here he's got an Actogram, and over here he's got a timeline of activity, and over here he's interconnected that with the social network visualization. This is another person in my department. Another one was working on collaborations in LiveJournal and looking at friends lists, who connected to whom in the LiveJournal community. It's getting picked up pretty quickly. It's got 4,000 downloads since last August when we released it, something over 200 messages in the forums from people asking and talking to each other about the system. Users are writing social network analyses. They're writing games where they want to display the dominance of different players over each other. They're building animated graph views, and they're writing out trust metrics. I encourage you to take a look at it if you need it. But to go back to my own work, to wrap up, this, of course, is not the only approach to trying to look at social and temporal information or the connections between people. So the temporal axis, for example, we've seen in a number of different contexts. One of the earlier ones was a project called Life Streams, which attempted to take every document that you'd examined and stretch them out over time so that you could scroll through them. Over here, we've got the project, Susan Dumais' group, called Stuff I've Seen, which tries to index every document you look at, every file you touch, and connect that both to people and somewhat to time. So they're working in a lot of the same directions that this project is. I think the important difference is that I talk about the relationships between sets of people and try and use that as an index into some of the same data sources that the Stuff I've Seen project is interested in. Contact Map has looked before at ways of socially clustering people, although they look at manually clustering by building the groups yourself. And last, we've been promised that Longhorn will have people fields, so that in the data set itself you can associate people with each other and with the files and systems that you touch. I don't know what the current promises on that are. Of course, there's lots of future work that I want to do on this. It can be extended in all sorts of different ways. In particular, I have looked at email right now. I'd like to connect this information to the file system and, in fact, to build a wide variety of data sources. Ultimately, then, this can become an infrastructure service that can be accessed by things like a social proxy, by things like the operating system itself to provide that information to different applications. To wrap up, then, social networks and temporal rhythms can lead us to salient, recognizable patterns, which can be used to design software applications, which help reveal the relationships between different people. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to also thank, of course, my many users and the test subjects on the field site, including the internship at IBM that made a lot of this possible, the team members who helped me out with the Young project, and the undergrads who implemented the email interface that you saw. Thank you very much. Be happy to answer questions. Please.
Ask a little bit more about the field study and the kind of users you talked to and sort of the differences in the patterns that you saw among users. Did they all have the same patterns, or did it segment, or how many users are we talking about?
We're talking about 15 users, plus a couple of follow-ups at the university since then. The users did not segment, obviously, by roles. Secretaries were more dominantly responsive to their managers than other people. But except for that, I couldn't have glanced at someone's visualization and said, this person is clearly a developer. Look at those clusters. There were some occurrences. I don't think I can give you any particularly strong ones about which patterns occurred. Some people were very careful about segmenting parts of their lives. So, for example, several of my users had work-specific email accounts and then the rest of their life email account. They were less likely to see some of the butterfly patterns. I only looked at the work-specific email accounts, both for privacy reasons and the way that the tool is built. Yeah.
One of the things that seemed interesting about it is connecting my email, and it would connect people that I send a lot of email to, but what about whether or not two of those people send each other a lot of email, and I don't really know that. So what I'm wondering is if this can be expanded so that maybe within a corporation or some other sort of group that it could analyze all of those email connections and expose to you some level of them, or you could select preferences based on what types of associations you would like to discover between all of the contacts that you associate with.
I think there's two possible answers to that. One of them is that what I didn't look at yet and what I'd like to is of incoming email. If you send me and Mark a message, this says something about how you feel Mark and I connect, and possibly this in turn tells me something about your relationship with Mark. If nothing else, you think he's worth sending email to with me. So even without expanding beyond your own inbox, there's still and your own outbox, there's still a lot of additional information that we could be mining and we could be connecting. You're also right, though, that this completely misses out on the fact that you could have all sorts of connections with Mark that I simply don't know about and that I simply haven't seen. I can see implications for bringing that across to a business setting and to bringing that out. It's got privacy risks that would have to be thought hard about, and even this much of showing people their own interconnections in the messages that they have actually brought up some people felt a little bit uncomfortable. They weren't sure that they wanted information to be portrayed that way. Connecting that many different sources is potentially, again, makes people a little uncomfortable and would need to be carefully thought about. But I think that the idea of getting the bigger picture is definitely an interesting one. Yeah.
Talking about emails that you sent, code you sent between yourself and your manager, papers that you sent to conference members. It seems like there's a natural grouping of documents based on different contexts that they're sent back and forth. And have you thought about how that can be applied, like actually creating groups of documents, and you think that would be valuable? Kind of like Haystack project at MIT.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I would like to see going into is to be able to socially connect a series of documents so that even if I haven't said that they are connected, the mere fact that they're associated with the same cluster of people in the same set of contexts does connect them. Yes. I see that as part of the future work. That's where I see this going. Other questions? Thank you very much.